Good morning and welcome to Soil as a Carbon Sink, and this first seminar focusing on the current state of knowledge. So why are we gathered here today? Well, increasing carbon storage in soil has been proposed as one of the most cost-effective climate measures, and a measure that also has positive impact on different aspects, such as biodiversity and soil fertility. So we're looking at a win-win situation here. And this topic has gained the interest of decision makers throughout the Nordic countries, and it sits high on the political agenda. But using soil as a carbon sink is a complex matter. So knowledge is developing at a fast pace, which might be tricky to keep up with, and still several questions remain unanswered. And this topic is also associated with challenges both in terms of policy development and in terms of implementation of identified methods and solutions. So the next question then, why do we discuss this in a Nordic context? And the reason here is really that there are some promising conditions for increased collaboration within the Nordic region in this topic. We have similar types of soil, we have similar type of climates, and we also have related goal formulations in terms of climate policy. So all this taken together makes it relevant to actually discuss this within the Nordics. And this seminar is the first of 4 seminars. So we're meeting here today, and for those who are interested, we will arrange 3 more seminars during the spring. And the purpose of these seminars is to stimulate knowledge exchange between the Nordic actors interested in this topic. And the seminars are initiated and financed by the Nordic Forest Research, Nordic Agri Research, and also the Nordic Council of Ministers Working Group for Climate and Air. And my name is Maria Thunberg. I'm a consultant and affiliated researcher at the Swedish University of Agricultural Sciences. And I belong to the research group Entrepreneurship and Innovation for Sustainability, and also the Center for Organic Production and Consumption. And I'm very excited to be part of this seminar series and to be here and guide you through this seminar and to listen to the speakers that we have later on. And before we kick off this meeting, I would just like to ask everyone to keep your microphones on mute, but please do engage in the chat function. So within Zoom, you have the possibility to post reflections, to ask questions, to share links and knowledge in the chat function. So please take this opportunity to talk to others within the Nordic region who are interested in this topic. So throughout the seminar, if it's during the keynote speeches or before or after, please engage in the chat. I would also like to say that we are recording this seminar and we will post the entire seminar, at least parts of it, on the websites later on, the websites of Nordic Forest Research and Nordic Agri Research. Okay, so what's on the agenda for today? So if I could switch to the next slide. There we go. We have this first introductory part. We would like to put the topic into context a little bit and hear from our hosts and learn a little bit more about you participating in the seminar. And then we have 3 very exciting speeches that I look forward to. So I'm happy to say that we have Professor Emeritus Johan Bouma with us here today, and we also have Professor Katarina Hedlund and Professor Raisa Makipää. And Johan Bouma will kick off the 3 speeches, and he will engage in what is, in his own words, an exciting potential in the Nordic countries to capture soil carbon following climate change. And after that, we have 2 presentations, one devoted to agricultural soils and another devoted to forest soils. There we go. So Katarina Hedlund will talk us through how to turn agricultural soils into carbon sinks. And after that, Raisa Makipää will talk about forest soils and their carbon sequestration potential. After the three speeches, I will provide you with an opportunity to have a quick chat with some of the other participants in this meeting. So basically just a few minutes to share some reflections, some main takeaways from these three presentations. And also, if you like, prepare some questions for then the dialogue with the keynote speakers, which I will facilitate. And then we will finish by 12 o'clock. So I would like to present the two host organizations for this seminar series. So we have Nordic Forest Research headed by Jonas Rönnberg, and we have Nordic Agri Research headed by Per Hansson. So please, Jonas, would you tell us shortly, what is Nordic Forest Research?
Thank you very much, Maria. Yes, I would like to also thank all the participants so far. We have 87 and there are still coming in more and more. So a lot of people, and that's also reflecting the importance of the subject. Yes, my name is Jonas Rönnberg. Overarching responsible for both of those two organizations. We have a common secretariat located to Alnarp, close to also Nordgen, which is known to the majority of people here, I guess. We are a collaborative unit under the Nordic Council of Ministers, but hosted by SLU, and that's why we're sitting also in Alnarp. We are trying to enhance, and if I focus on the Nordic Forest Research, SNS in short, Per will talk more about the NKJ, but on the forestry side, we try to enhance the collaboration in forestry, and not the least in the research side of things. It's supposed to be policy relevant, Nordic added value. We work with networks funded, and we also have our strategic projects. And this soil carbon issue is one of those strategic projects. In total, at the two secretariats, we have around 10 people working with us in various under various perhaps employers, like Maria and others. But this soil carbon thing is so important. We have a new vision at the council. We have a new action plan where this is one of the important parts. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jonas. So now we know a little bit about the Nordic Forest Research. And please, if you're more curious, you can enter the website and learn more about the strategic projects as an example. Per, if we have you with us, would you like to say a few words on behalf of Nordic Agri Research?
I will. Per Hansson, I'm General Secretary of the Nordic Joint Committee on Agricultural and Food Research. And it's called NKJ in Nordic. It's funded by the Nordic Council of Ministers and the Nordic countries. And as Jonas said, we are also hosted by SLU, and we share the secretariat at SLU Alnarp. And our objective is to strengthen research and innovation systems in the agricultural and food sector in the Nordic countries. And we do that by supporting networks for researchers and different activities for the Nordic group of researchers, but also by this kind of activities. The Nordic seminar series on soil and carbon sink is one example of this Nordic cooperation. We could also mention that it all started with a meeting between the ministers in the sector in Ålesund, Norway, a couple of years ago, when they started to discuss the differences between the Nordic countries in measuring and modeling soil carbon in the Nordic countries. So, through a small project, it has arisen as a quite impressive range of activities around this in the Nordic context. I hope you will all enjoy the day and will follow the journey in the rest of the seminars. So thank you and have a nice day.
Thank you so much for that, Per. And I can also say that the report we did back in 2018 as part of what Per just mentioned is also found on the websites here. So if you're curious, please have a look. Okay, so now we heard a little bit from our seminar hosts, Nordic Forest Research and Nordic Agri Research. And now I'm really curious about who's actually participating in this seminar. We have now 93 of you engaged here. And of course, I can't have you all presenting yourselves. So we arranged for a little exercise using Menti. So perhaps this is new to some of you and is familiar to others, but it's really quite straightforward and I will try to talk you through it. Basically, I'm curious about two different things. So what's the kind of organization that you're representing? And you will get some different options here. And then also, where are you based? So I will now ask my colleague Lovisa to share her screen and guide you into the Menti world. And we will learn at least a little bit about each other. So I would here encourage you all to go into this website, www.menti.com, which you can see in the top of your screen, hopefully. And when you enter this website, you will be requested to enter a code. And that would be the let's see, 7-digit code we have here in the top, 6806312. And there you will be able to ask, respond to the question. And I can see a lot of you have already found your way in. So your options here is really if you're representing academia, if you're representing public sector, or if you're representing the private sector. So let's see who we have with us here today. So I have now almost 40 of you answered the question. We have a majority from academia. I can see how this is shifting as you're entering your answers. We have definitely public sector represented here. And we also have a few actors from the private sector. That's really interesting to see. I'm very happy that all of you found your way in here. So this gives us some idea then who we're actually talking to in this seminar. Thank you so much for sharing this. And please, I can see it's still ticking here. It's not changing that much. I think we do have a majority of researchers and perhaps some students that are engaged with us here today. Thank you so much. I think we will, even though some of you perhaps have not entered a question yet, I think we will move into the next question. So I will ask Lovisa to post the second question. And here I'm curious about where your organization is based. So what is your home? I know these days we might be wherever since everything is virtual, but we get some idea of what you see as your base or as your home here. So we have Swedes, we have people from Denmark, from Norway, from Iceland, from Finland, and we also have a few others. I know that we have, for example, Netherlands represented here today. Well, that's very interesting. Thank you. I would really like to keep these two images because it tells us something about who do we actually reach with these seminars and who are interested in these topics. So thank you so much for that. Now we learned a little bit about who we actually have in this seminar. And I'm based in Lund in the southern parts of Sweden. And today it's almost looks like nighttime outside. It's very gray and very dark and very rainy, but that's November, I guess. Okay, thank you so much for that. And thank you, Lovisa, for sharing that. And I will now ask if we can have the presentation back. There we go. And now it's definitely time to leave the word to our first speaker of today. And I'm very happy that we have Professor Emeritus Johan Bouma with us today. Your work career has been at the Wageningen University and research. And you, I know, have a long research career within different aspects of soil and land evaluation. And I also know that you have been quite engaged sort of more in the policy development or policy kind of issues. For example, you've been engaged in the Dutch Scientific Council of Government and Policy, and you're also part and co-author of the mission board for soil health and food, I should say, and the report that you've been writing titled "Caring for Soil is Caring for Life." And today, Johan, we have you here. You will talk on the topic of exploring the exciting potential of the Nordic countries to capture soil carbon following climate change. So how are you today, Johan? Let's see if we can have Johan online.
Yeah, yes, I'm fine. And it's also very gray in the Netherlands, I can tell you. So there's no difference between the countries as far as that goes.
Many similarities then. I'm
Right.
very happy to have you with us, Johan, and I look forward to listening to your presentation. So I will open it up in a second here, and I will do my best to click it through for you.
Okay, thank you.
So it seems we have a little bit of a challenge here, but in a second, Johan.
All right. Well, then I can start by saying thank you very much for the introduction and very much for the invitation to take part in this symposium. Really appreciate it. You've seen the title, you've heard about it, some of my background. Next slide. Just have been part, as was said already, of the mission boards that study, that address, I should say, the Horizon Europe Research and Innovation Program for 2021-2027. There's quite a bit of money involved there. And the 5 missions that have been selected after a lot of discussion have been cancer, climate, water, cities, abbreviated here, and soil health and food, which is, of course, very interesting and certainly a great stimulus for soil science. At the same time, we have to deliver now. So it's that, well, that aspect that has a lot of attention now in the profession. Why missions? There has been a lot of discussions about that within the European Union. They have the feeling that too much of the research that has been done in the past has not really flowed through to practice, and people are not really aware of the role that European funding has played in generating research that had real practical meaning. So the link with practice, the link with people, with citizens has been very much emphasized. And we have delivered our report after a year in September, and the reference is here. Now, when you have a discussion, whatever discussion it is, it's always good if you have a common starting point, because if you are divided right away at the beginning, it becomes even more difficult. And there are 2 favorable starting points here. Nobody denies the importance of soils when you deal with environmental problems. Nobody does. That's good. And everybody is in favor of sustainable development. That's good too, of course, as long as it is framed in very general terms. Next one. Now, in my perception, the key points of the report that we have written, first of all, we should aim at the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals of 2015 that have been signed by 193 countries, also the Nordic countries, and the corresponding European Union Green Deal of 2019. Now that implies multifunctional land use, not only looking at production, which was the more traditional approach, but also to the associated environmental conditions. That is water quality, carbon capture, there we go, the topic of today, greenhouse gas emissions also, and biodiversity, all of it. And that creates quite a challenge certainly for the farmers. That's quite clear. The second thing is that we have to realize that soil scientists can't do it alone. They have to work with agronomists, hydrologists, climatologists, ecologists, economists, sociologists, psychologists probably, and that is an important lesson in the sense that we then have to really realize what are the core data that we can provide, what are the most essential things we can provide. And that's really a challenge. The third one is that we can show that healthy soils make the best contribution to ecosystem services, and next then to the SDGs and the Green Deal. 4 is that we should avoid scattered disciplinary research and work with land users in living labs, resulting in shining lighthouse showcases of sustainable land use systems. And it is then very important to apply existing knowledge first, because we have 100 years of research. We sometimes hear from politicians, you guys have been at it for 100 years, and the only thing you do is ask money for new research. I think that's a valid point. So apply that first and focus new research on gaps that show up. There is talk about basic research that it has to be curiosity driven. I support that, but particularly when you talk about theoretical physics and those kind of things. But when you talk about sustainable development, I prefer focused curiosity, right? Filling the gaps that you find when you apply existing research. And then the last point, don't only look at the present, but consider effects of climate change. Next one. Now, I assume you're familiar with the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. There are these visuals for soil and environment. It's very much 2, and that's food. 6 is water, 13 is climate, 15 is land use, but other ones are important as well. Next one. Now, what is important here is that in 2015, the European Geosciences Union organized a symposium in Vienna on the Sustainable Development Goals. And it was a group of people. We put out a paper, Kestra et al. And that's a bit of a landmark paper by now. We have more than 700 citations. And that illustrates very much that soils cannot by themselves achieve the goals of the SDG and the Green Deal. We need interdisciplinarity for the ecosystem services and transdisciplinarity to the next reaching the SDGs. And the underlying hypothesis really is that healthy soils deliver the largest contribution to ecosystem services and to the SDGs. But only when they're properly managed. If you have a very healthy soil and it is very poorly managed, it will not give a contribution. So the role of management here is also very important. And the next slide shows this figure in more detail, and it shows soil silage in the middle. There are the soil functions. They have been well defined also by the European Union, but they contribute to interdisciplinary ecosystem services, and they correspond with the SDGs I mentioned a moment ago, ecosystem services, and they lead to the SDGs that are the outer rim. And it's not only the ecosystem services that contribute to the SDGs, but also economic and social and other aspects that play a role. And it's important to have this image here to show that soil science cannot do it alone, if you like. Next one. Now, there's the point 4, that is the work with land users. In fact, I often compare the modern land user, the modern farmer, as artists in the circus, keeping at least 5 balls in the air at the same time: produce safe, healthy food, protect water quality, enhance carbon capture and reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and preserve biodiversity and quality of nature. That's a hell of a job. And every farmer has his own ideas, his own experience, and all the soils are different. So this is quite a challenge. So there's a need for highly complicated adaptive management, as they face variable weather conditions all the time. So there is no such thing as average weather or an average farmer. So we say researchers work with land users in living labs, work together, joint learning. And this is not new. I like to emphasize this. We have not invented this. This is done in many places, but it can perhaps be a bit systemized, but it's again not new. So what we're talking about is no top-down advice, but joint learning. And that's a real new role for research as we face wicked problems. The problems and the challenges for sustainable development, there is no single solution. And much of our traditional research is a problem, we study it, and there's a solution. That's not true with sustainable development. There are options with economic, social, and environmental implications, and they have to be balanced in such a way that it is acceptable. Nobody will be entirely happy because it's always a compromise, and that is a real new, challenge to really face that complicated situation. Next one, please. And then, of course, climate change, the big point 5. For soils, there are 3 aspects important. It's carbon capture for current conditions. It's the greenhouse gas emissions and effects of climate change. And that's the major topic of today. Now, first of all, a few remarks about carbon capture by soils. The French have in 2015 at the Paris Climate Conference proposed the 4 per mille proposal. You're probably familiar with that. Next one. And I think it's a stroke of genius in the way they've communicated this. They've said, that's the second column, in all the soils of the world, you have 1,500 billion tons of carbon. That's an incredible amount. It's the most, except for the oceans, it's the most, more than in tropical forest and whatever. Every year, that's the left one, 4 billion tons of carbon is being released to the atmosphere by human activities, all of it. So if we could increase only 4 per mille, 4.4% of the carbon in the soil, then we could cover all the carbon that is released in the air. Now, that's of course a gross simplification, but it's a triumph, I think, of communication, which is very important. Next one. Now, there is a recent publication in Nature Communication. I think that is very important because it summarizes the state of the art when discussing carbon capture by soils as an important climate mitigation measure. Just appeared. And the main recommendation is, not too surprising, I think, is that focus on arable land. Don't take permanent grassland because there is already a high organic matter content and you can hardly increase it. Arable land, and on soil types, it's relatively low carbon content. And of course, we know measures to increase percent carbon, green manure, animal manure, cover crops and rotations, compost. I think that's very important. There is a high potential using city household waste, not industrial waste, but so we know pretty much what to do about it. Next one. Now, I would like to take you quickly to some research we did in Holland some years ago, where in this case, for sandy soils and clay soils, Martijn Sonneveld at the time, the paper is cited, took a particular soil type, a sandy soil, a common sandy soil type, and compared the effects of different forms of land use. You have old grassland, you have reseeded grassland, you have arable land. And what we see is that the bulk density is quite different. It's high in the arable land, higher than in the grassland, but look at the organic matter contents, 8.1 for old grassland, 4.8 for arable land. And he could, after visiting 50 farms, relate the organic matter content to land use, past and present, with a surprisingly high R-square of 0.75. The next slide shows the same thing for a clay soil, a fertile, prime agricultural land, you can say. You can read the classification, but I don't want to bother you with that. The next slide shows again the results here, comparing conventional arable land, organic arable land, and permanent meadow. And we see again significant differences in bulk density and also big differences in organic matter. Conventional arable 1.7, permanent meadow 5.0. Again, possible to get an equation, a regression equation relating organic matter content to land use, current and past. Next one. So what I really would like to stress is that every soil has a story to tell, but our human ability to really understand what she's telling us is seriously flawed, despite all our methods, models, and intelligence, the real one or the artificial one, okay? But we try, realizing that, I guess as with any woman, the real truths will never materialize, but we can learn about the way she was formed, her potentials, limitations, and resilience. And she really talks to us in the field, not only through isolated samples. So my suggestion would be get out there in the field and study the results of thousands of experiments that are right there waiting to be explored. Okay, next one. The number two, the greenhouse gas emissions. There is a whole host of new techniques with satellites, with drones to measure greenhouse gas. This is just an example of measuring methane, and we should really apply a lot of new measurement methods. And the next slide shows a few examples of automatic monitoring equipment for groundwater tables. Below you have a proximal sensor that is very successful in measuring carbon contents of soil very quickly, very reliable. The proximal sensors are less suitable yet to measure nutrients in soil, but they're very suitable to get organic matter content. So you get a lot of measurements in a very short time. Very exciting to see all these new technical developments that we should apply. Next one. Now, about the climate change and agriculture, there's this map. This is an old map from the IPCC, and I wish there were newer ones, but it shows areas where agricultural production, looking at climate change, 2050, 2070, will increase. A lot of these red areas will be 40 or 50% lower because of the problems that are there. You see also the green areas where it will be the same or higher, and you see Scandinavia right up there, dark green, projected significant increased potential to produce agricultural crops. And I'm very sorry to see that Iceland is not colored, but they have to tell us what that color will be. Okay, next slide. Shows the story, a more recent paper in Nature showing, looking at the outside historical human niche where people could live. Now you see all these dark red areas that will be so hot and so dry, but particularly so hot that it becomes very difficult for human habitation. Of course, those people don't have air conditioning as we do, okay? So there's a great pressure, and there's going to be a very significant effect of climate change that is becoming quite clear. Next slide. So large areas in the world will be too dry and too hot in 2050 and beyond. Fertile soils near rivers and the sea may flood because of projected sea level rise. And Holland will build dikes, but a lot of countries are not able to do that. But also there will be longer periods of drought, more intense showers. So the demands on the soil will increase. And still 10 billion people must be fed by 2050, according to the FAO. And this is an old statement, so the percentage will be higher now, I think. Agricultural production will have to increase by at least 40%. And I think it's very interesting to mention that to the Nordic countries, that the World Food Programme received the Nobel Peace Prize in 2020. I think that's only a sign of what is to come. And I think it's a very prophetic kind of thing to give that prize to that particular program. Now, the Nordic countries will experience better conditions for agricultural production, and this has to be much better specified than we can do so now, I think. And they may have to contribute to fluxes of food from north to south, because what are we going to do with all these hungry people in Africa, for example? And the potential for carbon capture at the same time may increase as well. But I think it's also the potential increase of production next to the carbon capture that deserves attention. So protect our soils and our farmers. Preserve healthy soils and unhealthy soils, make them healthy, and make sure that farming remains an economic good opportunity for farming. Next slide, please. Now, there was a recent Italian study I took part in that explores the effect of climate change based on simulations by a soil, water, atmosphere, plant model, applying the IPCC scenarios. And this paper also presents a method with indicators to determine soil health versus the ultimate soil quality. Now, I cannot say much about this now, but if you read it, you'll find more information there. The next slide shows just a few examples. Next one, please, of one graph from the paper. You'll see here 4 diagrams, 4 climate periods from reference climate to the climate IPCC projection from 2017 to 2021. The first bar is the healthy soil, what they would produce. The vertical axis production, calculated production. Then the second one is when you increase the organic matter content, how much higher the production would be. The third one is when you have 20 centimeters of erosion, and the fourth one is when you have a plow pan. Now you see there's a dramatic effect of that. And you see the top one is a more sandy soil. This is the lower one, a more loamy soil. You see soils act quite differently. That's the story that every soil has to tell, as far as I'm concerned. And you see a strong effect of climate change here. And that is also different for different soils. And that allows us to see the potential for the future. Next one. So what are basically my conclusions? Aim for sustainable development, and we all agree to that, of course, but embracing the United Nations SDGs and the Green Deal, realizing that healthy soils play a key role contributing to a series of required ecosystem services. 2, explore the implications of projected climate change on the Nordic countries. More favorable conditions for agriculture for climate mitigation, carbon capture, with suitable soil management. And 3, practical adaptation of innovative forms of agriculture will only be realized when scientists work closely together with land users in living labs, resulting in lighthouses joint learning rather than top-down advice. Next one.
I think that's it, Johan.
There's another one. There's one more. I would like to say, today the Nordic countries, tomorrow the world. Why not? Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Johan. I think you raised a number of very interesting points and definitely a call out for some more action. I heard, for example, that you started off with talking about the importance of a joint definition or a common understanding of what we're dealing with. And you mentioned sustainable development in broad terms and that soil is important. That's our common ground. But I also heard you definitely asking for more action in terms of transforming or transferring research into practice. And you said things like, we have to deliver now. So I would really like to come back to that when we have our dialogue later on. So how can we actually do that? How can we actually take all that we know from research and implement that in practice? So maybe that's one thing we can come back to. But I also saw from the chat function here, Johan, someone is asking, so what is your definition of healthy soils? You mentioned healthy soils in your presentation. How do you define that? What is that to you?
Okay, well, the definition, as we have it in the report, is its capacity to contribute to ecosystem services that in turn deliver to the SDGs and the Green Deal. Okay, so the scheme I showed is central to that. It's the capacity of a soil to contribute to these ecosystem services. That's basically the simple, excuse me, the simple definition that we try to use.
Well, thank you so much for that clarification. And I can see that there's some engagement in the chat function and that you're sharing some papers and ideas, and then that's really nice. So please take this opportunity to use the chat. And I will also ask Johan, if you don't mind, to have a look on the chat function. And if any of you have questions for Johan, then please use the chat function and post those questions. And we can see if we can pick up some of those questions maybe later on in the discussion, but please use the chat. Okay. Thank you so much, Johan. And we will then move on to the next speaker. So we now have the privilege of having Professor Katarina Hedlund with us here today. And Katarina, you're based at Lund University, and you're focusing on different aspects within soil as well. And one thing that I picked up on was that you're researching on the concept of ecosystem services and sort of their value and how they can be part of promoting sustainable use of soil and agricultural biodiversity. I think that's very exciting. And I also see that you have a range of different relevant affiliations. For example, you're connected to the Center for Environmental and Climate Change Research and the Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services and a Changing Climate, etc., etc. And one of the things, Katarina, that Johan was mentioning and talking a lot about was how do we bring research into practice. And I know that you have also been researching and working on projects looking at local adaptation strategies. So maybe there's some connection there, and we can hear sort of your comment later on this call out from Johan Bouma. But Katarina, I'm very happy to have you with us, and we will now see if we can change the presentation so we can let you share your presentation.
Okay.
And I know that today, Katarina, you're based in Lund, so you have exactly the same kind of weather situation outside the window as I have.
Yeah, typically Scandinavian weather, I'd say.
So we can see your presentation. It's now in full mode, so please go ahead.
Okay, thank you. So as you just heard, we're working on lots of aspects of soils, anything from how farmers manage them and to what type of ecosystem services they would provide us. And today I give you an overview of a more part of this area, which deals with how we can turn agricultural soils into carbon sinks and what the evidence base is of this today and what do we actually know. And I will start by showing the pie chart of why soil carbon, but maybe we are all on the mission of this, so maybe this was a bit too much for everyone. But soils are, as everyone said, you know, one of the largest sources of carbon. A part of it is the inorganic carbon, which is stored in former organisms and as carbonates, but lots of it is actually global soil organic carbon. And I think just showing this can convert anyone to be a soil missionary, I'd say. Well, anyway, we've been working with agriculturists and soil threats, anything from mainly from a biological activity view, because this is the kind of, to me, the engine of the soils providing most of the services. And with the intensification of agriculture that we see in most of the world, and especially in the south of Sweden, there's a decline of soil carbon in the fields, and that also gives us a decline in biological activity and the diversity. And it leads to a set of functions that are not as good as they used to be. So we have erosion, compaction, reduced resistance to pests, also less nutrient provisioning. But how can we then increase the soil carbon? Well, we've been working with evidence from long-term experiments for a long time now, and I will show you the results of this very soon, but the major factors that in agriculture that we can influence the soil carbon is how we manage the soils, whether we have tillage or reduced tillage or no tillage systems, whether we take the residues away from the fields, so we put them back again. And here we have a trade-off with the greening of our energy supplies, also to use this straw as energy. And then we have the fact whether we keep our soil services covered with winter crops or with cover crops and so on. And then, not at least, one way where we have not really explored yet, I think, in agriculture, and that is to produce more perennial crops that have much longer roots. And this is a picture I've stolen from the internet, where you have this perennial grass that is actually on a trial at SLU in Alnarp, but you can really compare the normal wheat, which is a winter wheat here, with this extremely huge root from this perennial cancer wheat. And this is, I think, is a mind changer for everyone, and also for experiment to see, can we change the way we grow the crops? So we have done a large review of the evidence. We've done a systematic review on soil carbon and agriculture management. And this had a global scope, but we took out tropical areas. So we said, you know, let's take any area where you practically can grow wheat, so which is large parts of the world. And then we looked through the types of agriculture management they used in experiments. We screened more than 25,000 publications, and we used around 750 in the review. And the management we found were exactly those I talked about. That was tillage, organic amendments, which is then putting back the harvest residues, applying fertilizers, which actually also changed the soil carbon, and different types of crop rotations. This is now published, so, and all the database is open access. There's an open access map, so anyone can go into the map and see what type of experiments have we found, and there are contact details of all the data holders. And we have the metadatabase of this review also publicly accessible. So as you see, there's lots of evidence from agriculture experiments in the States and in Europe, and some in Australia and in South America. And of course, this has a climate explanation, but I think one of the general results we found that even though we do this in different countries, the results are quite similar. So I show you here the results where we did the meta-analysis of tillage systems, where we then have 350 studies, and with a set of experiments in each of these studies too. And in a meta-analysis, you then compare we have the worst system on the left side, which we here assign as the conventional tillage that turns soil completely over, with either you have a no tillage system, or you have a medium, a reduced tillage, which is the intermediate. Now I get this I'm not sure, is you also have this top thing?
I think
so. The upper one is no tillage versus intensive tillage, I think. But in all of the systems, we can see that reducing the tillage, we have a positive effect on the soil carbon within the upper 15 centimeters. And we, in 5 cases out of 6, there's no reduction in the ones below 15 centimeters. And the magnitude of this is for a concentration, it's around 2.3 grams per kilograms of soils, which is about 0.2% or 4 tons per hectare. This analysis is also done on stocks for those that are kind of real soil scientists that wants to know this. So, but I'm not going to show all the details here. And we are also working with crop rotations in a systematic review. And this is now transformed from the MISTRA EVM consortium into FORMAS, where they have an analysis group and are working on the soil rotations. And they've done the meta-analysis. It's not final, and it will be published quite soon. But I can report to say that when we have rotations with legumes in and with perennials in the rotations, maybe as grass lays, which is a common practice in the Nordic countries, then we can increase the soil carbon about 2 to 3 grams per kilogram. So it's the same magnitude as with the tillage. And here we have a set of around 175 studies that we've used, and this is updated also from the mapping exercise we did. But when you do this comparison in long-term experiment, you often look at a conventional management towards an improved one. And here, this is a very good publication that highlights this, what actually happens in the soil. So we may find a positive effect of tillage in comparing 2 experiments and by crop rotations, but over a time period, this would actually mean that we are still losing soils. See, so when you have a comparison of an ending time of an experiment, you may interpret it as you can save more soils. But I would like to change, this is a mind changer for me, and I would say that yes, there's a positive effect, but it means that we are losing less carbon. It doesn't mean that we are gaining carbon. And in this way, so then we went through all our data and we looked at what data we had that produced longer time series where you actually can detect this. Because I think this is a very important thing if we want to predict the soil carbon and use it for climate change. And if we do individual assessments, we will only say that one management is better than the other, but not to gain carbon. We are still losing carbon. So what we did was to go into our database and we looked into where we had time series that are more than 30 years. So and also had data points so we could see how they would change through time. And then we sorted out the same groups, tillage, amendments, fertilizers, and crop rotations, and also checked them for where they were used in combinations. And here I'm going to show you a graph of the tillage in this data set. So you can see that if you have the conventional tillage, then, so these are projected timelines from our meta-analysis. So these are not real data points, I could say, but these are statistically significant from each other, all of them. So this is not published yet, it will come very soon. But anyway, conventional tillage reduces the soil carbon at the highest rate. If you have conventional tillage and add quite high levels of nitrogen, you can reduce the reduction. And if you have reduced tillage, then you can reduce the reduction even further, but you need to add more things onto it to go positive, right? And then we looked at all of these managements, and we didn't care really what type it was, but see how many of them in combination did they use in the experiment, and saw that you actually need all 4 of them to go plus. You know, all of them had a significant positive effect of the kind of the least intensive management of all of these 4, but to go plus on a change per year, you needed all of them. And how can we then change it? So if we look at some of them, I'm just going to show you more in the management that they tried in these experiments and single out some of the worst ones, which is, you know, if you go into the UK in some of their long-term experiments where they only used intensive cereal production with monocultures, like in some of the Rothamsted experiments, you lose roughly on average 1% of carbon per year, which is quite a lot. But this is a relative, so it's like your bank interest rates, you know. If you have an interest rate of 1.5% that you have to pay off every year, so this is also the relative rate of change is like you consider it as your mortgage rates, right? And then when you can add things you can do, you can have more fertilizers, you will also reduce the carbon losses. If you add organic manure, you lose less. If you can add straw, this is from a Danish long-term experiment where they added back the straw that they took from the fields, they will still go negative. If you look, when you go positive, you can actually increase. There are experiments where they had cover crops, where you added twice as much straw to your fields as you actually produce in a field, or maybe 4 times as much, which is not sustainable, but yes, you can increase the carbon rates, and having lots of farmyard manure, but that will increase eutrophication. But having perennial grasses as grass lays in the if you have a 2-year rotation, 2 years of lay after each other, then you have very much higher increases in carbon than if you have them in every 4th year, but breaking them after a year. And bioenergy grasses are very good in increasing carbon too. So I just want to show you the picture. This is what it, so I have not yet updated to the last Lucas database, but this is what it looked like in 2009. And you can see across Europe, we have various problems with, we also have there's also a kind of a glacial history and geological history behind the actual carbon rates. But looking at the arable land only, there is a high potential of increasing the carbon across Europe. And these areas that have lower usually kind of coincides with a high intensity. And we can certainly see a problem with the former Eastern European countries where soils have been deprived of because of no real ownerships and so on. So we have other kind of a political legacy here. If we look in the Eurostats, we can see how common the different types of management are across Europe. And this is also data from some years ago, because this is data that they collect from all farmers every year, but they don't send them out into the statistics every year. So, but we have a few of them are reducing tillage, and I think in the Nordic countries here in Scania, we did a survey among our farmers, and around 60% of the farmers here use reduced tillage of some kind within their crop rotation. Maybe not on all crops, but in most of them. Harvest residues are also put back to a certain extent, but it's also retrieved and used for other purposes. Bare soil is still quite prevalent across Europe, especially when you have spring crops. And then cover crops is a coming issue, but not as common across. And I think that we've been working with the farmers in our region, and we have some of these really front runner farmers here that using the cover crops, and there's a big interest for using cover crops to not have bare soils when you have spring crops. So with all this data, we are also working on modeling what the soil carbon rates would look like and what the yields would look like and how this will be influenced by change of weather and extreme weather. But that's another story. So not time for that today. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Katarina Hedlund. You provided us with sort of an overview of the different systematic literature reviews that you've been conducting and taking a sort of broad view, and also being able then to show how these different methods are important to see in combination. And you said at one point that to go plus, you need all the mentioned methods. So I think that's quite interesting, and perhaps something we will come back to as well in the dialogue. I picked up on one thing, Katarina, from the chat function here. And one of our participants, and now let's see if I can translate this into English correctly, not being a chemist. But Elin Röse is asking, how about the net effect for climate as more nitrogen can lead to more nitrous oxide? I hope that's correctly translated from Lustgas.
Yeah.
Any reflection on that, Katarina?
Yeah, generally in models, the modelers transform with a kind of a factor that the more nitrogen you put on fields lead to more nitrous oxides. But that's not, it's really tricky to measure this and to model this in reality, because it depends very much on the oxygen contents in the soils. And when we've been measuring in really intensive soils that are quite well drained and so on, that's not a very high problem. The problem is more from where you have more extensive soil, we discovered higher rates. So I think this is an issue that really deserves more concern, and it is a real concern, but it's not as easy to say that more nitrogen leads to more nitrous oxides.
Okay, so thank you for your reflection there, Katarina, and the answer to Ellen's question. And I would also encourage you, Katarina, if you don't mind, to have an eye on the chat function.
Yes.
And if any of the participants would like to post more questions or have some reflections or comments now after your speech, then please do engage in the chat function.
Yeah, thank you. I can't see it when I'm presenting, so that's the disadvantage. Yeah.
Fair enough. You can concentrate on presenting while you're presenting. So thank you so much, Katarina, and we will come back to you later on in the dialogue with both you and the two other speakers. Thank you so much. And now I would like to invite our third speaker for today. And I'm very happy to have Professor Raisa Makipää with us here in the seminar. And you're working at the Luke, the National Resource Institute in Finland. And you're focusing here on the soils in our forests. So Katarina, we're focusing on the agricultural soils, and now we will move into the forests. And I know you have some quite exciting engagement in different kind of projects. For example, and if I pronounce this correctly, the Cameo project, where you are aiming to provide sort of a novel climate change mitigation concepts. And if I understand it correctly, you also want to increase the collaboration between various stakeholders and to have an impact on Finnish climate policy. So here we also have this policy connection, which I hope we can discuss more later. So Raisa, I'm very pleased to have you with us, and let's see if we can transfer to your presentation and get you up and running here.
Okay, thank you for invitation and kind introduction. I tried to share my screen, and let's see whether you can see it there.
Yes, we can see it. It's not in full mode.
I will change it to full mode, but then I lose the control with others. But you can hear me and you can see I moved to full mode and hope it.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Okay, thanks again. So my presentation is about forest soil and the carbon sequestration potential, and I will start from global.
Raisa, can I just ask you, I think right now we can see your sort of next slide mode. So if you go into the top and you can change into a view.
I will change to an.
Yeah, I think that should make the trick.
Okay.
Perfect. That's excellent.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Maria, so much. So I will start from global perspective and emphasize the global role of soils and forest in greenhouse gas balance, and then I will discuss about soil in climate convention and in national greenhouse gas inventories, and end up with some forest management practices and their role in soil carbon sequestration. That's my plan today. And this slide or similar one you may have seen several times. It shows that the global emissions, the sources for greenhouse gas emissions are about 10% from land use sector, from loss of forest, and remaining of largest part, more than 90% comes from fossil sources. And then we have carbon sinks in oceans and in forests. And I want to emphasize this role of forest. More than 30% of the carbon dioxide emitted to the atmosphere, it's sequestrated by forest, and therefore reduce the rate of climate change. What does that mean in long term? Sorry, hopefully not COVID pandemics here. So what does it mean in long term in global climate? This is kind of illustration what we have emitted since 1870, and how those emissions increase CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere, and then the current level of the current concentration, current CO2 concentration in atmosphere is 405 ppm, and without these carbon sinks in oceans and in terrestrial ecosystems, it would be already 550 ppm. So forests and oceans really have role in mitigation of the climate change. They have had that, and hopefully they have that also in the future. And that's already acknowledged internationally and included in climate targets of various countries. After Paris Agreement, EU has included forest carbon sinks and targets to regulations. We call that land use change and forest regulation. So there are targets for carbon sequestration in the forest, and majority of the developing countries have included land use sector in their national determined contribution, which means that they have a plan how much carbon they are aiming to sequestrate by agricultural practices or forest practices. And all countries are currently reporting their carbon sinks as a part of their greenhouse gas inventory. So internationally, in global scale, we also follow what countries are doing and how well they are reaching the targets what they have set and agreed internationally. And now we come to Finland, from where I will show this example. It's net greenhouse gas emissions and removals of the land use change and forest sector. That's left, and then more details about forest sector on the right hand side. And this is something what all countries are reporting. And in Finland, if we see whole sector, which is net sink of carbon, there are also carbon sources. Croplands are carbon sources, as we learned already from previous presentations, and forest, land in general, it's carbon sink. So negative values are nice for the climate because this negative side here indicates that there is a carbon sequestration. So forests as a whole, they are carbon sinks, and also this green part is wood products, so they are also carbon sink in case of Finland. But agriculture and settlements are carbon sources. Then if we go to the more details of this forest sector here, then we can see that there are also emissions in that sector. It's not all carbon sink. When we go to the forest, there is a carbon sink of trees, this red one, and then there is a carbon sink on mineral soils, but then in forest land, organic soil, so peatlands managed for forestry, trained and managed for forestry, they are carbon sources. So not only good things, but something where we have relatively large emissions also in forest sector. I already mentioned that countries annually submit their national inventory reports to climate convention, and soil greenhouse gas emissions and removals are reported according to these categories. But this is something what I want to underline, that in most recent submissions, all EU countries were able to report they biomass carbon stock changes. So trees they report and they have some information on that. But when it comes to dead wood, or when it comes to soil on forest soil, on mineral soils or peatlands, there is only 9 and 13 countries who are able to report anything. Others don't have any numbers, which means that soil carbon sink estimate is really highly uncertain in Europe. And if you want to have overall picture of about role of soil carbon sink or source in Europe, we have to improve these methodologies which are applied across the Europe in the inventories. That was the first message. At European scale, more methodological development is needed in order to report carbon sinks and sources in all countries. But then I promised to talk a bit about effects of forest management on forest soil, and this is just to illustrate what management in general means to the forest. This figure is for biomass carbon stocks from clear cutting to forest stand at age of 100 years. And here we have a trend where trees grow, there is the increasing volume and increasing biomass in trees. And these drops here means that there is a thinning, so part of the trees are harvested, and that's the reason why biomass carbon stock decrease in those points. And in general, it is so that in unmanaged forest there is more biomass. They are stocking density is higher, and they sequestrate more carbon than managed forest, and that holds also in the long term at ecosystem scale. Even when trees start to grow slower, there is accumulation of the carbon in dead wood and soil carbon pool. And this illustrates soil carbon pool, what happens, and the stand age is here from clear cutting to 100-year-old stand, and soil carbon stock. And after clear cutting, there is a decrease, and in the case that you follow this development of trees, then carbon sequestration continues up to the 100 years and reach the carbon stock which was there initially in the beginning of the rotation. So anyhow, in managed forest, carbon stocks tend to be lower than unmanaged side, and this is simulations what I show here in the figures, but empirical data from quite representative data set repeat the result, so it's consistent with empirical results. And this is simulation about same thing for region where we have unmanaged sites, and then two alternatives for management: continuous cover forestry or rotation-based forestry. In both cases, it's so that carbon stocks in soil, this part of the column, and carbon stock of trees is is higher in unmanaged site, and this is on regional scale, and not too wide differences between these two management regimes. Then I want to remind you that in the European scale, it was so that only very few countries were able to report soil carbon changes for peatlands, for peat soils. And all those countries who were able to report soil was emission source. So peatlands were emission source in all those countries who were able to report that. And in Finland, we have studied that in more details, and we know that fertile trained peatlands are emission source, not that much less fertile sites. So we have site types, and most fertile classes are 1 and 2, and there we have relatively high emissions, and total what we calculate for whole country. It's also remarkable in our greenhouse gas balance. But anyhow, here the message, you don't have to read the whole busy table. Here the message is that fertile trained peatlands are emission sources in boreal conditions, and it's because because of the drainage, and then we have a relatively thick organic layer which is decomposing and producing high CO2 emissions. Then we have developed methods where we can identify which parcels or which forest parcels are emission source. We combined the model for soil hydrology and models which predict greenhouse gas emissions as a function of soil water table and site fertility, and we were able to derive these estimates for state-owned forests. So colored part are those forests which are operated by Metsähallitus, meaning that they are owned by government. And for those parcels, we calculated where are the emission hotspots, and we're able to identify. So the red spots here indicate that there is a peatland site where soil is a high emission source. And now this information is merged to their planning system, and they try to invent new methodologies how to manage these sites to reduce soil emissions. But anyhow, we have spotted where they are, so that's something what might help manage forest managers. And what can be done to reduce emissions? What we are testing now is continuous cover forestry. And here the idea is that in conventional even age management, we have relatively low water table when we have standing stock there. And then after clear cutting, it's elevated, and there is need for further ditching and to reduce the water table and to allow trees to grow. and this regeneration needs maintenance of ditch network, and this is harmful to aquatic systems and to greenhouse gas emissions and also to biodiversity. So alternative might be to go for continuous cover forestry and to go for selective cuttings and to remain standing volume over 100 cubic meters there all the time. And we already know that if water table is kept under 30 centimeters, there won't be methane emissions, and this is in relative terms as a function of groundwater table. So the water level there, we see that CO2 emissions are higher with the lower water table. So we are aiming to maintain water table somewhere around 30 to 40 centimeters if possible. And we have already demonstrated with experimental studies that by selective thinning, by reducing evapotranspiration of the trees, we can, and leaving ditches as they are without further maintenance, we can elevate water table to some extent. So it looks promising, but we still need further measurements from those sites. And this is actually just repeat what is the concept, what we are aiming to do. So we aim to get water table to reasonable level, which means that CO2 emissions are reduced and methane emissions won't be increased. When I go to conclusions, maybe I don't read these through. I just emphasize that forest and forest soils have large impact on global carbon balance, and they also contribute on soil. On overall biodiversity. Soil biodiversity is important component for ecosystem biodiversity. So we have to kind of find sustainable management practices in forest to maintain soil carbon sequestration capacity and to reduce CO2 emissions from peat soils and to maintain soil biodiversity. And currently, our tools and reporting methods are not comprehensive and uncertainties are large. There is a lot to improve. We have some views about more sustainable management practices, but we need more testing in order to reduce emissions and negative environmental impacts. And yes, further research is needed on soil processes. And my final slide is just remind you that World Soil Day will be soon, 5th of December, and you can find more information about events and webinars and links from website maintained by FAO. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Raisa. Thank you for that presentation. You went through a lot of different things here, but you definitely talked us through and gave us some details on the carbon in forest, looking at the living biomass, looking at the mineral soils, and then looking at the organic soils. You also mentioned at some points one of the challenges here, which is how can we actually sort of measure and what is it that's being reported and what are the uncertainties in that. And I think maybe that challenge is something we can come back to. And then you, by the end here, you came into peat soils and the water tables. And I would like to, if that's okay with you, Raisa, pick at least one or two questions from the chat function here.
Nice.
So someone is asking here, it's Kerstin Berglund wondering, how do you keep the water table at 30 centimeters in practical forestry? Do you have any reflection on that, Raisa?
Yeah. Thank you for this this question. It's repeated several times, and it's relatively stupid from a scientist to say that we keep that in 30 centimeters. It's not possible to keep that exactly somewhere. There will be variation anyhow, depending on vegetation, depending on precipitation and conditions. But but in principle, we are aiming to elevate it from the present stage, and we keep on saying that the target is 30 centimeters because it indicates that we try to keep that at the level where we have a top layer with living roots who are doing well, and and then over the growing season it should vary around that, and any increase now the water table might be as deep as 80 centimeters or with new ditches down to 1 meter, which is absolutely too deep, and we try to do what we can to elevate that. But you are right, our question is smart. It's not possible to keep that exactly at that level. It varies.
Thank you for that answer, Raisa. I hope you are happy with that, Justin. I also have another question here, Raisa, for you, and it's with regards when you talked about the effect of management on soil carbon stock, and you had 2 diagrams on that slide, and it's Vilde Haukenes who's asking, can we say that after a clear cut, the soil carbon storage is restored after around 70 years? Is that a correct sort of interpretation of your figures there, Raisa?
In general, it's correct, but then it very much depends on vegetation, and I have to also underline that holds for mineral soils. In peatland, it doesn't hold. There we are losing carbon at the rate which is not kind of recovering with the growth of trees. It's all time releasing from soil this carbon by the composition of the peat. But on mineral soil it holds in general, but depends on vegetation and trees. And if we have very if you continue management with very heavy thinnings and leave very little trees behind, then it might lead to loss of carbon also in older forests.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. So it holds for mineral soils in general, but it depends on vegetation, etc.
Yeah,
thank
right.
you for that, Raisa. Okay, thank you everyone for engaging in the chat function. I'm very happy to see that we have some activity there. And I would like for the other speakers, as I ask for you, if it's okay to keep an eye out on the chat, and perhaps some of the participants would like to ask you a question or share some reflections after your talk here. Okay, so we'll now listen to the 3 speakers for today. And I would now like to give you the opportunity to get to know some of the other people engaged in this area. So I would like to divide you into groups of 4 or so people, and we will do this randomly. And the idea here is that you will get a chance to present yourself briefly, so perhaps your name and your organization, and then to engage in some reflections or discussions on what have you heard so far today, or what are the main takeaways from your perspective from the 3 speakers' presentations. And then if you perhaps come to the conclusion that you have a few questions you want to post, then you can always put them in the chat function, and the speakers will look at that, and we will try to bring it into the dialogue in a 15 minutes or so. But really, this is a chance for you to get to know some other people within the Nordic countries interested in this topic, and to share some reflection and knowledge based on the seminars today or from your wider perspectives. So for those of you who are familiar with Zoom, you know how this will go about, but for the others, it's really quite simple. when technology is working with us. But basically, you will get a question asking you to join a breakout room, and you just press OK or join that room, and you will then be transported into a virtual breakout room. And I will leave you about 10 minutes for discussion. So a short period of time, but at least enough to share some reflections. And we will then automatically transfer you back into this main session, and we will then engage in a dialogue with the 3 speakers. So I will ask my colleague here to start transferring you into breakout rooms, and I will see you back in approximately 10 minutes. I can see that a few of you are still in this main session room, which is fine if you want to rest here for a couple of minutes. But if you do want to join a breakout room, there should be a question asking you to join a room, and you can accept that. Or you can, in your menu under More, I think you can then click in and see if you can access your breakout room. And if you have any issues and you want help, then please just unmute your mic and I will try to guide you. So welcome back to all of you who are finding your way back into the main room. Do we have everyone gathered back here? A few more seconds. I hope you had some nice conversations and perhaps met some new colleagues. Okay, I think that's it. I think we have most of you back with us here. So thank you so much for engaging in those group discussions. I know in a few groups there were only 2 of you, but at least hopefully you got some new contacts or at least a chance to share some reflections or discuss some of the things we have been talking about so far this morning. I would now like to move into a new phase of this seminar, and that is a dialogue with our speakers of today. I think this is such a great opportunity to have Raisa Makipää and Johan Bouma and Katarina Hedlund here with us. So I would like to take the advantage and posing a few questions to you. And I would also like to encourage all of our participants once again to please use the chat function if there's anything you want to raise or discuss with our 3 speakers. So please use that. And I think now we will remove the PowerPoint and hoping we get a little bit of a larger picture of our speakers and also a chance to see each other for those of you who chose to put your video camera on. So first of all, thank you so much to Raisa, Johan and Katarina for your presentations. I found them very interesting, and what I can see from the chat as well, that raised some reflections. So thank you for that. And I would like to kick off with one question, and then we will see where this conversation goes. But from your perspective, and this is a question to all 3 of you, from your perspective, what's the value and potential in Nordic collaboration on this topic? I know there's some collaborations ongoing already and that are well established, but what's the value of those collaborations as you see it? And is there a need for sort of a more extensive collaborations within the Nordic, and what potentials are there in such collaborations? So maybe if we start with Raisa, who was the last presenter, what's your view on that?
Thank you for very good questions. Before I answer, I had to say that from the chat, I noticed that there were some questions for me, but now they are not in the chat, so I don't see them any longer. So I'm not able to answer on those. Either you send them to me separately or repeat them here. But anyhow, this Nordic collaboration is very important because our conditions are pretty similar in comparison to rest of the world. Like we have boreal forest, we have these coniferous tree species, they dominate in our landscape and so on. And the systems and processes what we are studying and knowledge what we are gaining from various countries, it's really feed on understanding what we all together generate. And I emphasize that there is a critical need to improve greenhouse gas inventory systems, both in Scandinavian countries, Nordic countries, and whole of Europe and globally. And we can start from Nordic countries and share the information and help others to improve their systems. And then the other thing is that when we have a look on soil biodiversity, there is the fantastic new methodologies to analyze soil biodiversity, and that train is going fast. And by doing things together, we are learning quicker. And there is much to learn about soil biodiversity. So all collaboration might support that quick learning and sharing information and methodological advances. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Elsa. If I turn to you, Katarina, the train is moving fast and we need to collaborate on this complex matter. What are your reflections on what Raisa said and on this question?
Yeah, I think she's right in collaboration, and I want to raise it into another kind of how to cut the cake. And that I only talked about agriculture today, but I think I think we can learn so much about how we work with forestry and agriculture, because I mean, soils is just they become different ecosystem because of the plants that are on them, and the times on how things are changing are still the same, whether they're in especially for the biodiversity and for the soil structure, would be very much more dependent on what's growing on top of them than actually the soil. So I think we can learn lots of things from each other. And from policy point of view, in agriculture, we do short-term decisions, we do year by year, but in forestry, we have much more legislation. We think much more long-term because the trees are growing slower. So here, I think these areas should really be integrated to learn from each other.
Well, thank you. So not only collaboration across the geographical region, but collaboration between agricultural scientists and people working within forestry then. I think that connects to something that Johan, you were talking about as well. You even mentioned psychologists and people researching climate, etc. But thank you, Katarina. And Johan, from your perspective, being a bit of an outsider, not based in the Nordics, what's your thought on this?
Well, you're addressing me now, right?
Yes.
Okay, sorry, yeah. Well, of course, just like sustainable development, everybody is in favor of cooperation, and that's of course good. It is then good. I think I have no strict opinion about the Nordic countries. You know, it's difficult enough to have an understanding of what's happening in the Netherlands, but it's always good if you have different partners, that every partner identifies a certain kernel of activity in which they have specific expertise they can contribute into the whole group. That would be a very general comment. But what is important also, I think, is again to look at the whole system. And what's up now is the new common agriculture policy with 350 billion euros, where there is a very significant move, I believe, going from Pillar 1, which is just a per hectare payment for agricultural soils, to more money for Pillar 2, which is greening. And they even mention eco services, they call it. Well, it's the same as ecosystem services. So I think that is an important mechanism we should really pursue, because we have one basic problem. I thought the presentation from Lund was very interesting, as they put all this literature together. That was very valuable, I think, but it is looking back. So we want to look forward as well. And there are great opportunities to work together and find ways to channel some of that money into this sustainable development business. And I would strongly support that. And if that would be the overall theme of what is happening, that's indeed uniting agriculture with the forestry and other types of land use, that I think is a very promising idea for the future.
Well, thank you, Johan. And I also wanted to ask you, because as I understood it, you were really keen on actually getting research results and research knowledge into practice. So could you elaborate on that just for a moment? So how can we actually get these methods and the knowledge that we have into practice?
Yeah. Well, like I said already, I think it's a key issue in the sense that we know a lot. We know an awful lot what to do. Minimum tillage, zero tillage, crop rotation, very valuable to know all of that, but it is not being applied enough. Why not? Well, it's mainly financial. You know, farmers have to make a living. It's that simple. And so when you talk with them, and then the approach you have to take to practitioners, it's a very general statement, is that you join them because they have a very difficult job because of all these contradicting things, to work jointly with them and develop things together. And every farmer having a particular soil, having a particular background as a farmer, you have to join forces there and develop the best system for that particular farm. That's why we talk about living labs. And when they are successful, we talk about lighthouses, which are very good for the community at large, to show that it can be done and that agriculture is not a bad guy all the time, right? Agriculture is polluting well, some do, of course, but show examples, but it's very much a matter of attitude. And I think the research community will really have to make a shift. Not all of them, but a group who can do that kind of thing. We used to have people advising farmers, very successful in the past, but that was one single issue, production, right? Now there are these 5 balls in the air, and these are wicked problems. We have no single solution. We need tailor-made solutions, not confection, and that requires a different type of advice to farmers, not people that know everything, because it's impossible to know everything, but who have a contact areas, who can use the internet and try to shape examples that really work in practice and that are financially attainable, with the prospect. That's why I keep emphasizing the future climate change, with the prospect, the prospect in the Nordic countries that things will get better. When I talk with my Italian and Spanish colleagues, things are getting worse. When I talk with Africa and Africans and all that. So that's why I mentioned that kind of thing. Your point at the horizon, your light at the end of the tunnel, whatever you want to call it, is positive, I think, and that's unique. You guys are privileged in that sense, right? We are doing all right in Holland, according to the projections. Our climate will correspond in 30, 40 years with the climate now in mid-France. Well, you can still have agriculture, but still it's a challenge with drier periods, heavier showers and all that kind of stuff. And the soil plays a key role in there, and really distinguish different types of soil. The sand is not the clay and it is not the peat. We all know that, but we tend to forget that sometimes. And I think those soil stories are very important in this overall context.
Well, thank you for that, Johan. You mentioned a lot of different things here, but for one, you mentioned that the Nordics might have a sort of a great potential when we're looking at the effects of climate change here, but that there are quite some challenges to get research into practice, and the financial aspect is one important part of that. I would like to ask Katarina, within your research projects, do you see the same challenges here as Johan mentioned in terms of actually getting research into practice, and how do you work with that within your teams? Yeah,
we work both with working towards the farmers, and so we use the farmers advisory services as kind of interpreters. And then we also been working with making economic forecasting for using new methodologies to the farmers, so they can see that on a long-term basis, they can actually earn money by implementing management that in a short-term horizon would make them to lose some money. And that's why we convey this to the policymakers, so they can see if we need to pay incentives for changes, this could be a way of doing it, and so on. So we deal with this under the concept of, so we value the ecosystem services that comes from especially the soil carbon in the fields, and then we can value it for the farmer and for the society, because they have different values. It's not that you can pay for carbon as we do in the carbon trading services, but you can see on the effects they have within the business model for the farmer and within the societal economy. So.
Yeah, thank you for mentioning that as well. And there are quite a few conversations ongoing on different business models and how to perhaps monetize on capturing or storing carbon in soils. Maybe that's something we can come back to during the seminars this spring. Raisa, I would like to, I mean, you're most welcome to also respond to the question of how to bring research into practice, but I also specifically would like to just hear your reflect on this challenge with the measurement and the insecurity in the reporting data. And I think that also sort of is relevant looking at agricultural soil. So if you could please comment upon that, Raisa.
Do you mean challenges in measurements in general soil, in forest soil?
Yeah. So how can we move forward that? What's the head?
Yeah, there are two challenges. This large spatial and temporal variation in the soil carbon stock, and we need if we measure, an interesting variable is the stock change. So we need very large number of sample plots and very intensive sampling to have representative sample for one plot. So that's the reason why soil carbon changes are in greenhouse gas reporting. Soil carbon changes are reported on the basis of the models. So models are validated based on those detailed, accurate, extensive measurements, but annual reporting is based on models that rely on those measurements. And in addition, when you go to the peat soils, there is further problems because it's stock changes are even more difficult to measure, and they are also less relevant because it's not only stock changes but the balance between CO2, methane, and N2O emissions, and you have to measure those fluxes with the gas analyzer. And then you face also the problem that you have to have pretty many measurement points in space in one plot or in one forest, and then you have to have continuous measurements over the growing season and over the whole year if you want to have a really relevant estimate for the site. So it's expensive, it's laborious, and the spatial variation makes it really really hard. But without doing that, we don't learn what are the processes and what are the levels and what we have to monitor in detail. So there is no way out other than measurements, and along with the measurements, we have to further develop the models that help us to provide annual estimates for variables what are interesting for us.
Thank you for that answer, Raisa. I'm sure this is a topic that interests at least some of the participants here. I recognize some of the names and know that you're working with similar questions. I would just like to get a very brief statement from each of you, Katarina, Raisa, and Johan. We are during the spring organizing 3 more seminars. From your perspective, what would be an interesting topic to focus on within this umbrella of soil as a carbon sink? What focus area would be interesting from your perspective to engage in? So just very briefly, if we start with Katarina, perhaps.
Yeah, I think it's, for me, it's one area which is really important is just what Raisa also mentioned, it's the time span that we consider when we manage to improve. And I think we need to think long-term, and we need to make policies be long-term. We need to make decisions be long-term. So, and also we need to learn how to model long-term. In forestry, they know it's long-term, so they do that. But I think this is a challenge, I think, that we need to address.
Thank you. And Johan, briefly, what would be an interesting focus area for coming seminars from your perspective?
Well, I very much agree with this point of long term. That's why I mentioned the climate change, which I think is very important. And I think it would be good if you could pay attention to that. And also the fact of why measures are adopted or why are they not adopted. We talk about it now in general terms. It's a key issue. And I think that would be very important. And also the link with the policy arena, where we have now laws and regulations here that are very much means-oriented, means to reach a goal, whereas we should become goal-oriented. And that's where the ecosystem services could really provide some new opportunities. So the regulation story, that is troublesome to a lot of land users at this point in time.
Thank you. Thank you for that. And how about you, Raisa? What would you like to see focus on?
What I especially would like to see more Nordic collaboration is linkages between soil carbon sequestration and soil greenhouse gas fluxes and soil biodiversity, because the drivers of the processes are microbes. And now we have so much new methodologies which can be used to invent and explore more about role of microbes in soil carbon sequestration and greenhouse gas fluxes. That is something what I would like to see in Nordic context that we do together.
Thank you so much for that. I think that's very valuable input for us. And thank you so much to all three speakers to engage in this dialogue. And I will now ask my colleague here if we can get our PowerPoint presentation back for the very final slide for today. And I would like to extend a warm thank you to everyone who participated throughout this seminar. It was very nice to see the interest that this topic gained. And I hope you all got some new reflections or some new contacts through this seminar. And I would like to ask all of you the same question as I just asked the three speakers, because it's very important for us that we stay relevant for you. So keeping in mind that we will organize 3 seminars this spring, we have some ideas of what we could focus on, but I would like to take this opportunity to pick your brain. So what would be interesting from your perspective to devote these different seminars to? Either just put it in the chat here and now, or send me or my colleague Lovisa an email with your suggestions. So you find our our email addresses here on the slide. So really, what specific focus would you like coming seminars to focus on, and who would you like to listen to? Who are the stars in that area? So again, a large thank you to our 3 speakers, Professor Raisa Makipää, Professor Emeritus Johan Bouma, and Professor Katarina Hedlund. I'm very happy you joined us today. Thank you to Nordic Forest Research and Nordic Agri Research for hosting this seminar, and for the Nordic Council of Ministers Working Group on Climate and Air for actually financing most of it. So thank you so much, everyone, and I wish you a nice lunch wherever you're based. Bye.
Bye, and thank you.